In the heart of a quiet suburb of Brampton, Ontario, there is a house that at first glance looks no different from the rest. A well-kept lawn, clean windows, and a family car in the driveway. This place was a symbol of peace, stability, and family happiness. But behind its walls was a darkness that the neighbors did not even know about. One evening in 2024, this house became the center of events that shocked not only the city, but the entire country. What began as an ordinary family idyll ended in a tragedy that changed the lives of everyone involved forever. What happened in this house? How did a place that was supposed to be the most secure in the world turn into an arena of unspeakable horror? And what made the man who was supposed to protect his family cross the line from which there is no return? This story will make you question how well you know those around you. Listen carefully, because what you are about to hear is not just a tragedy. This is a story that reveals the darkest corners of the human soul. Malcolm and Naomi Bennett met in Jamaica, where they both grew up in traditional families where the importance of family values and working together was an integral part of life. Their marriage was the result of love and shared dreams of a better future. When Malcolm was 24 and Naomi was 20, they decided to leave their home island and move to Canada. Settling in Brampton, Ontario, they began to build a life from scratch. Malcolm joined the police force, aiming to become a community protector, while Naomi dedicated herself to making her home a home and working as a teacher's aide at a school for children with developmental delays. They were persistent, hardworking, and mutually supportive, which allowed them to quickly adapt to their new environment. A few years after moving to Canada, Malcolm and Naomi became parents. The birth of their daughter Ayla was an important milestone in their lives. Born with developmental delays, Ayla required special attention and care. It was not only a challenge for the parents, but also a test of their unity. At the time of the incident, Ayla was 13 years old. She was a child with intellectual disabilities, which meant that her thinking and emotions remained at the level of younger children. Ayla loved to draw, and her room was filled with colorful drawings of fantasy worlds, unicorns, magical forests, and magical creatures. She loved fairy tales, which she often told her mother, adding her own illustrations to them. Ayla often spent time with Naomi, who was not only her mother but also her best friend. They would go for walks together in Chingukazi Park, where Ayla would enthusiastically feed the ducks and collect leaves for her applications. Her childlike sincerity and innocence were a source of joy for her parents, but also made her vulnerable to reality. For Malcolm and Naomi, raising Ayla became the center of their lives. As a police officer, Malcolm often said that his mission was to protect not only the community, but also his own family. His colleagues and neighbors considered him a role model, but at home he was reserved and did not always openly show emotion. His authority remained unquestioned, but his relationship with his daughter was limited to formal conversations. Naomi, on the other hand, was the one who fully devoted herself to the family. She provided Ayla with the stability she needed to develop comfortably, while also trying to support her husband. Her work at a school for children with developmental delays helped her better understand her daughter's needs and provide her with an environment where she could feel safe. To neighbors in the community, the Bennetts looked like the perfect family. Malcolm was a respected officer with an impeccable reputation. Naomi was a loving mother and caring school employee. And Ayla was a charming little girl who always smiled and waved to neighbors as she passed. They participated in local events, attended church, and were always there for each other. But behind the facade of harmony were cracks. What seemed perfect turned out to be just a shell-hiding darkness. None of the neighbors could have imagined how far the problems hidden behind the closed doors of their home would go. In the first months of 2024, Naomi Bennett began to notice changes in the behavior of her husband, Malcolm. At first, it seemed like small things that she attributed to fatigue or professional stress. Malcolm had always been dedicated to his work, often working overtime to provide for his family. But suddenly everything changed. Malcolm started staying home more often. He refused the extra shifts he had previously accepted without hesitation and now spent more time with his family. At first glance, this seemed like a welcome change. Naomi thought that perhaps her husband was choosing to focus on his family, but his behavior became increasingly strange. Malcolm began to pay excessive attention to his daughter Ayla. He spent more time with her than ever before, and he did so in a way that seemed unusual even for a caring father. He sat with her while she drew, helped her make scrapbooks, and sometimes even picked her up from school, even though Naomi usually did. What was particularly disturbing was that Malcolm often stayed at the door of Ayla's room. He would find an excuse to be near her, either to check if she was okay or to talk about her drawings. His voice was quiet and soft when he spoke to his daughter, almost coaxing. Something about this excessive attention made Naomi uneasy, but she pushed her thoughts aside, trying to convince herself that her husband was simply becoming more involved in her daughter's upbringing. The first real worry came when Naomi was washing Malcolm's police uniform. Among other things, she found a bottle of lavender-scented lotion that belonged to Ayla. It was her favorite lotion that she used every day. Naomi recognized it immediately because she always left the bottle on the shelf in her daughter's room. Her heart fluttered. She held the bottle in her hands and tried to find some logical explanation for why it could be in her husband's pocket. Perhaps he had just taken it by accident. But the more she thought about it, the more strange it seemed to her. A few days later, Naomi overheard a conversation that finally shook her confidence. It happened late at night when she was passing by Ayla's room. The door was slightly ajar, and she heard Malcolm's quiet voice. "It's our little secret," he said gently. Ayla replied something slurred, but her childlike voice was calm. Naomi froze. The words "little secret" stuck in her mind like a cold stone. What did he mean by that? Why did he sound like that? Naomi tried to find an explanation for what was happening. She argued with herself, is it just my imagination? Or am I getting myself all worked up? He's her father. He couldn't. But part of her subconscious already knew the answer, although she was afraid to admit it. She began to observe Malcolm's behavior more closely, noticing every little thing. At the same time, she felt isolated in her fears. Who could she tell about her suspicions? What if she was wrong? But what if she wasn't? Naomi felt her anxiety growing with each passing day. She could no longer look at her husband the way she used to. With each passing day, a fear was building in her mind that she could no longer ignore. It was an ordinary night at the Bennett home. The clock in Naomi's bedroom read 3 a.m. when she suddenly woke up. Her eyes fell on the empty half of the bed. Malcolm was not there. At first, she thought he had gone to the kitchen to get a drink of water or to the bathroom, but a strange feeling began to grow. Something didn't seem right. The silence in the house was oppressive. She listened and heard faint sounds coming from the hallway, from Ayla's room. Naomi carefully got out of bed so as not to make any noise. She went to the door and froze. The faint light coming from under the door of her daughter's room seemed alien. Her heart began to beat faster. She took a step forward and saw that the door was slightly ajar. Malcolm was sitting on Ayla's bed, dressed only in his underwear. His hand was on the leg of his daughter, who was wearing short pajamas with a unicorn print. He was gently stroking her leg, and his voice sounded soft but ominous. "This is our little secret, remember? No one can find out." Ayla was silent, her face puzzled. She lay motionless, looking up at the ceiling. Her childlike eyes were filled with fear and confusion. Naomi froze. Her mind refused to accept what she was seeing. Seconds seemed like an eternity. Her blood was boiling, and rage began to overwhelm her shock. She sharply pushed the door open, which creaked open, cutting through the silence. "What are you doing?" Her voice sounded sharp, almost shouting. Malcolm flinched and jerked her hand away. He stood up quickly, trying to speak calmly. "It's not what you think, Naomi. I just wanted to make sure she was okay." "Ayla, come here," Naomi said, gesturing to her daughter, her voice trembling, but already filled with determination. Ayla got up and ran to her mother. She held onto her waist, hiding behind her back. Her body was shaking, and her eyes were filled with tears. Naomi held her close, creating a barrier between her daughter and her husband. "I saw what you were doing. You were touching her," she screamed. Her voice sounded angry and determined. Malcolm took a step toward them, his tone changing. "Naomi, you need to calm down. You don't understand the situation. I would never do anything wrong." "I understand everything," she said, "and I won't let you touch her ever again." Malcolm realized that excuses wouldn't work. His expression turned menacing. "You don't know who you're messing with. Do you think anyone will believe you? I am a police officer. I am respected in this community. And you'll ruin everything for you and her if you go against me." Naomi didn't listen to him, her eyes burning with anger. You are a monster, and I'm not going to let you destroy us anymore. She took Ayla's hand and, keeping her eyes on Malcolm, slowly walked out of the room. Her heart was beating so hard that it felt like it might burst out of her chest. When they entered the bedroom, Naomi closed the door, locked it, and grabbed her phone. Her hands were shaking, but she knew she had to act. She couldn't stay silent any longer. Her main goal was to save her daughter, no matter the cost. Naomi sat in her bedroom still with her phone in her hand, her fingers hovering over the screen. Her mind wrestled with a chaos of thoughts. Should she call the police or try to solve it herself? Ayla, who was sitting next to her, had already fallen asleep, tired from the events of the night. Her quiet breathing seemed to be the only source of peace in the room. Suddenly, the bedroom door began to shake. Malcolm stood on the other side and shouted, trying to get her to open it. Naomi, open the door! You're going to destroy our family. No one will believe you. His voice was loud, but he was already panicking. He realized that the situation was getting out of hand. Malcolm was not going to let Naomi get help. He was pounding on the door with his fists, threatening her. If you think you can ruin my life, think again, he shouted, his tone becoming more and more threatening. Naomi was trembling with fear and anger. Everything she had been pent up for months was now bursting out. She knew this could not go on. She would not let him hurt their daughter anymore. Her eyes fell on the drawer where Malcolm always kept his service pistol. The decision came suddenly, like a lightning strike. She opened the drawer, pulled out the weapon, and for the first time felt the cold steel in her hands. Her heart was beating faster, but her eyes were filled with unbreakable determination. She pushed open the door. Malcolm stood in the hallway, his face distorted with anger and despair. He saw the gun in Naomi's hands and froze. "What are you doing?" he said, his voice mixed with fear and contempt. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she replied. Her voice was cold and confident. Malcolm took a step forward, trying to convince her. "Put the gun down, Naomi. You're out of your mind. It won't solve anything." But Naomi was not listening to him. All the memories of his threats, his manipulations, and what she had seen that night merged into one wave of rage. She raised the gun, her fingers squeezing the trigger. The first shot sounded loud, like thunder in the silence of the night. Malcolm backed away, holding his shoulder, but Naomi did not stop. Her hands no longer trembled. Shot after shot, her anger, pain, and fear spilled out with every pull of the trigger. The corridor was filled with the sound of gunfire and the smell of gunpowder. Malcolm fell, but she kept shooting. 14 times. Her eyes burned with the rage she had been holding back for years. When she stopped, his body lay motionless, his blood spreading in a dark pool beneath him. Naomi stood panting over her husband's body, her hands trembling, but the gun still in her hand. She felt her legs carrying her to Ayla's room. She opened the door and saw her daughter standing in the corner, scared and shaking. "It's over, dear," she said, trying to calm herself more than Ayla. But the thoughts in her head were chaotic. She thought about what would happen next. The courts, the journalists, the community's condemnation. How would the world look at their daughter, knowing what had happened? She was sure that society would not leave Ayla alone. Tears streamed down her face. She raised her gun and pointed it at Ayla. "I love you more than anything, baby. I will always protect you." Ayla looked at her mother, her eyes filled with innocence and fear. The sound of the last shot cut through the silence. Naomi dropped the gun to the floor and fell to her knees. Her cries of despair and pain filled the house where a seemingly perfect family once lived. The quiet night in the suburb of Brampton was suddenly broken by the sound of gunfire. The first shot came like a bolt from the blue, causing the neighbors to freeze. But then the shots began to sound one after another, without a break. There were 14 in total, and they made people grab for their phones to call the police. "I heard the shooting. It was terrible. I didn't even dare to go outside," one of the neighbors recalled later in an interview. A few minutes after the call, the street was flooded with police cars, their lights blazing blue and red. Residents of the neighboring houses came out into their yards, anxiously watching what was happening. When the police entered the house, they were prepared for the worst. The sound of gunshots and then the unexplained silence aroused their suspicions. They moved cautiously through the corridors, checking each room. At the end of the corridor, they saw Naomi. She was sitting on the floor by the bed in Ayla's room. Her hands were bloody and her face was covered in tears. She was holding her daughter's lifeless body in her arms. Her voice was quiet, but the police could make out what she was saying. "Forgive me, baby. I love you so much. I'm sorry." A few steps further in the other room, Malcolm's body lay, still dressed in his underwear. His body was disfigured by numerous bullet wounds, and blood was spreading across the floor, forming a huge puddle. One of the officers cautiously approached Naomi. "Mrs. Bennett, you need to get up. Are you okay?" Naomi looked up, her eyes filled with pain and emptiness. She did not struggle as she was lifted off the floor and handcuffed. She only spoke softly. "I killed them. He destroyed us. I was protecting her." News of what happened at the Bennett home quickly spread among neighbors and further into the community. People were shocked that a model family that everyone knew and respected had become the epicenter of such a horrific tragedy. The community quickly divided into two camps. Some believed that Naomi had done the best she could under the pressure of terrible circumstances. She was called a heroic mother who was forced to do the unthinkable to protect her daughter. "She did it for Ayla. I can't blame her," said a neighbor who had known the family for many years. Others, however, could not understand her actions, especially the murder of Ayla. For them, it was a crime that could not be justified. "I can't even imagine how you could take the life of your own child," said a local resident who heard the shots that night. As police began their investigation, the truth about Malcolm began to surface. Medical examinations and records collected confirmed what Naomi had suspected. Ayla had been systematically abused. This went on for years, and Malcolm used his power and authority to cover up his crimes. Ayla's diaries found in the house shed light on her suffering. In one of them, she wrote, "I can't tell my mom. He says it's our secret, but I want it to end." These recordings became key evidence in the case. Society was shocked in two ways. On the one hand, by the horror of Malcolm's crimes, and on the other hand, by the tragedy that it led to. Naomi Bennett's trial was one of the most high-profile in Brampton. It attracted the attention of not only the local community, but also the national media. The courtroom was packed to capacity. Journalists, activists, friends of the Bennetts, and even those who had never met them before wanted to hear her story and understand what made this mother take such extreme actions. The prosecutor's office built their case around an obvious fact. 14 shots and the decision to kill her own daughter cannot be justified. The prosecution lawyer emphasized that Naomi had time to stop, but she acted decisively and in cold blood. "We understand that Naomi Bennett was going through terrible circumstances. But is it possible to justify a person who took her own child's life? Ayla was a victim, but her life was taken not only by her father, but also by her mother, who was supposed to protect her," the prosecutor said in his opening statement. The prosecutor showed video from the crime scene, the evidence they had collected, including the gun with Naomi's fingerprints on it, and emphasized the number of shots fired, which indicated premeditation. Their strategy was simple: demonstrate to the court that Naomi committed a murder that could not be justified under any circumstances. The defense, however, presented a completely different picture. Naomi's lawyer built his case on the fact that years of trauma, manipulation, and betrayal by her husband had led her to an emotional collapse. Testimony from doctors and psychologists confirmed that Naomi had suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, after learning about her daughter's abuse. She was a woman who had lost everything: love, trust, and faith in the world. She tried to protect her daughter, but the burden of the horrors she saw and the fear for Ayla's future broke her. Her actions were not cold-blooded. It was an emotional explosion of a person who could no longer stand it, the defense counsel said. The court heard testimony from neighbors and family friends who spoke about Naomi's love for her daughter and how she gave her all to ensure that Ayla had a happy childhood. Ayla's recordings were also presented, confirming the systematic abuse by Malcolm that had been going on for years. Naomi decided to take the stand herself. Her voice trembled as she recounted the events of that night. She cried as she recalled holding Ayla in her last moments. "I couldn't bear the thought of her having to live with what happened. I loved her more than anything in the world, and I could not allow the world to make her a victim a second time. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I know what I did was wrong, but I am asking you to understand me," she said in front of the court. After 2 weeks of court hearings and lengthy deliberations, the jury found Naomi guilty of second-degree murder in Malcolm's case and guilty of involuntary manslaughter in Ayla's case. The judge reading the verdict emphasized that this was one of the most difficult cases in his practice. He acknowledged mitigating circumstances, including trauma and stress, but emphasized that Ayla's life should not have been taken, even in desperation. Naomi was sentenced to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. This sentence reflects the complexity of the case. We must recognize the tragedy that has occurred and ensure that this never happens again, the judge said at the end. The Brampton community was shaken by the tragedy. Memorial events in Ayla's honor gathered hundreds of people who brought flowers and drawings to the school where she had studied. Her innocence became a symbol of how easily lives can be destroyed behind the facade of a perfect family. Trust in the police was shaken after Malcolm's crimes were revealed. People began to question how such actions could go unnoticed and demanded reforms to better control the behavior of officers. Many questions remain after the verdict. Can Naomi's actions be justified? Many saw her as a victim of circumstances, while others saw her as a criminal. The community also sought answers on how to prevent similar tragedies in the future, emphasizing the importance of support for victims of domestic violence. The Bennett tragedy has left the community in a state of constant reflection, a lesson no one would want to repeat,